Thank you. And there's a continuation between Pesach and Shavuot. The holiday itself called Atzeret. Atzeret from the word la'atzor, stop, just like Shmini Atzeret. And therefore, if there's a connection between a starting point, which is a Pesach, and the end point where is Shavuot, then means that everything in between, all Sfirat HaOmer, is going to be some sort of extended Chol HaMoed, intermediate days, right? Because that's what we have between two holidays. Think about Sukkot, think about Pesach, right? We have the first days, we have the last days. In between, we have Chol HaMoed. If Pesach becomes the first, and then Shavuot is the last, then we have some sort of a long Chol HaMoed intermediate days, extended intermediate days, 49 days. Okay, just another way to think about it. Now, another perspective to look about it for a second. Pesach, we said it's the beginning of a journey, right? It's the Exodus. We left Egypt, the beginning of a journey. What happened in Sukkot? Well, Sukkot is representing the journey itself. What we do, we sit in the sukkah. Why we sit in the sukkah? Because the Jews sat in the sukkah in the desert, right? So Sukkot represents that time of the journey, the duration of the journey. Also, if we have the beginning of the journey, we have the duration of the journey. What's going to be in Shavuot? That's going to be the end of the journey. That's going to be the ending, meaning getting into Eretz Yisrael. That was the end of the journey. Okay? And indeed, by the way, we went over that a long time ago in the book of Joshua, in the 6th chapter. We learned that the Jews celebrated Pesach just before they crossed the river. So they celebrated Pesach. I don't know how long. We don't know exactly how long, but a short while after that, they crossed the river, the Jordan River, and they go into Eretz Yisrael. So that's around the time of Shavuot as well. Think about it. There's another way to look at that with the bread. What's the bread that represents Shavuot? Pesach. It's the matzah, lechem oni, poor man's bread. What's the bread that represents Sukkot? It's the manna, the heavenly bread that came from the heaven, right? Because we're in the journey. That's what sustained the Jews in the desert for 40 years. Okay? What's the bread that is associated with Shavuot? Don't say cheesecake. That's not that. No, it's actual bread I'm talking about. It's the shtei halechem. It's the special korban, the special sacrifice that was brought in Beit HaMikdash on Shavuot. What was so special about that sacrifice? It was 2 loaves of bread. What was so special about that? That was made from the wheat of that year. Until that point, that the Kohen actually held it up, those loaves of bread, you couldn't use the wheat of that year. The whole thing of Yashan, right, that you see sometimes in bakeries, Kemach Yashan, whatever, all that, that's because of that. Because you couldn't use the wheat of that year, only the previous year, until Shavuot, where that special, okay, so you can see that. Now, if this is a holiday that celebrates the land, right, said Bikurim, the first fruit, the Shtei Halechem, it's the it's the wheat of the new year, it's the time of harvest, right? We celebrating the land. What do you do when you go to exile? How you celebrate the land when you go into exile? Think about it. It's like celebrating Yom Ha'atzmaut before 48. You can't. It becomes a problem. So what happened to Shavuot is something that is similar to other aspects in our religion. It's a theological shift, right? We know when in terms of the destruction of the temple, what happened? We moved from bringing sacrifices to tefillah, right? Tefillah, prayer, replaced the bringing of the sacrifices. Okay? study Torah, Torah study becomes the most important aspect. That was not in the times of the temple. The times of the temple was what the avodah, the rituals. Now it's after destruction, it becomes Torah study. Who was the main figure in the times of the temple? Was the Kohen. Who becomes the main figure in the community after destruction? It's the rabbi, teachers. Right? So we move from a society that, or a religion or practice that relies heavily on rituals into more theoretical study, prayer, okay? Something that you can do also in the exile. Okay. Now, but how do we call Shavuot? And it's also in our tefillah. In our tefillah, we call it Zman Matan Toratenu, time of receiving the Torah. Well, guess what? As I mentioned before, the Torah doesn't talk about that. The Torah doesn't say that was the time. But, however, the Torah does give us hints that it was around the time, right? It's the third month, right? If we start, according to the Torah, we start counting from Nisan. So Nisan, Iyar, Sivan, that's the third month. In the third month, the revelation at Sinai and we received the Torah. Okay. And by the way, the time of the holiday changed every time. I'm going back to the times before we had a set calendar, before the times of Hillel. So how do they decide when it's going to be Rosh Chodesh? By witnesses, looking at the wound, witnesses coming to the court in Jerusalem. Well, therefore, sometimes it was a 2-day Rosh Chodesh, sometimes it was only one. Sometimes, therefore, based on that, the holiday of Shavuot was on the 6th, sometimes it was on the 7th of Sivan. There was also, by the way, a major debate between the Purushim and the Baitusim, right? There were different sects in the Jewish community in the times of the Second Temple. And there was a major debate between the Purushim. We follow that tradition of the Purushim, saying that when the Torah talks about Mimachorat HaShabbat, after, right, a Shabbat, according to that tradition, is interpreted the Chag, i.e., Pesach, meaning, where do we start Sfirat HaOmer? According to our tradition, the second day of Pesach. Well, the Baitusim disagreed. The Baitusim said, no. When the Torah says Shabbat, it means Shabbat. Therefore, Sfirat HaOmer is always going to start on Sunday. It shifts. What if Pesach falls on Monday? That means, according to the Baitusim, Sfirat HaOmer is going to start the next week. Okay, the Baitusim are gone. Don't worry about it, Matzi. They're gone a long time ago. But it's just to give you an example of how all that stuff about the date of the holiday was fluid. Okay, so we said, so the Torah doesn't tell us the date, but it gives us hints, right? It's the third month, and it's originally agricultural holiday in its nature. And what Chazal are doing, they're connecting Har Sinai, right? Mount Sinai with Temple Mount. The mount, the place, Beit HaMikdash, that at that point no longer exists, it's after the destruction, right? The place where the rituals took place, sacrifices, etc., now gone. Well, the temple is gone, right? Destroyed. So the connection becomes to the other mountain, Mount Sinai. And what happened there? Receiving of the Torah, which all makes sense because what? The most important thing is Torah study now. So we're going to celebrate the Torah. So the mountain in which rituals were done, mountain, also a mountain where the Torah was received. And this is how it became the holiday in which we receive the Torah, Zman Matan Toratenu. Now, I know Brenda was part of Torah study on the first night of Shavuot. Yes, she was. And it's a common custom. I gave a class also in a different location. We had classes here all night. It's a common practice to study Torah on the first night of Shavuot, which makes sense if we're celebrating the receiving of the Torah. But what's interesting is that Torah study is not called Limud Torah or Limud Leil Shavuot, that we'll learn on Shavuot night, but rather it's called Tikkun Leil Shavuot. Tikkun from the word letaken, to repair. Well, if there's some sort of a repair going on, that means something is broken, right? And indeed, we believe that our world is broken. There's tragedies, anger, jealousy, oppression, injustice, abuse in our world. But we in Judaism, we don't accept it as a fact. Okay, listen, what can we do? That's the way it is. No. In Judaism, we believe in harmony and we believe in hope. And therefore, the desired reality is one of hope and harmony. And if our world is broken and needs a repair, it means it's out of balance. But we have the power to repair. And guess what? We have the power to repair even what was done many, many years before. How do we do that? With one word. It's called chesed. Chesed, it's not the way we think about chesed. Loving kindness is a Christian terminology. That's not. Chesed, and I'm going to quote Rabbi Sachs here. Rabbi Sachs says, it's the love that we do. We believe in actions. The love that we do. It's not acts of kindness, it's acts of love. There's a difference. There's a difference. I can be kind to somebody, but it's not an act of love. Okay? We can go into a whole, I think we had a couple of weeks ago, we had a class about love. Right. So we saw it. Which brings me to the story of Megillat Ruth, because after all, this is Tanakh class. So we're going to talk a little bit of Megillat Ruth, but not really in the context of Megillat Ruth. We're going to talk about the context of other parallel stories, other deja vus. So Megillat Ruth, the book of Ruth, Chazal said the following: Megillah zo lama nichteva. What was the purpose that this book was written? Lelamedcha kamatov gomlei chesed. To teach us the value of gmilut chesed, of chesed. Chesed. Connection to Shavuot, why we read it on Shavuot, the connection to Shavuot is very, very clear. A, the story itself takes time, the time of the harvest, just like Shavuot. Number two, Ruth herself is a convert, and she is a symbol of accepting the Torah, just like the Jews at Mount Sinai accepted the Torah. What? She was the first convert. Ruth was the first convert. Yeah. Of course, the Torah was given in Mount Sinai, hundreds of years before. Okay. Then the third element is chesed. The Megillah, the book itself, is full of chesed. And the fourth reason is that it's the day on which King David was born and died. What's the story of Megillat Ruth? Very, very quickly. Prominent family from the tribe of Yehuda in Israel. Elimelech, his wife Naomi, two sons, Machlon and Chilion. There's a famine in the land of Israel. They decide to move to the land of Moab. Over there, the two boys marry local girls, Orpah and Ruth. Short while after that, they die, and Elimelech also dies. Naomi, she's alone. She decides to go back to Eretz Israel. Famine, I guess, is over. It's years later already. She decides to go back to Israel. She has nothing to do in Moab. And Orpah, the daughter-in-law, one of the daughters-in-law, decides to go back to her father's home to stay in Moab. And Ruth decides to stick with Naomi and go back to Israel. And she says to her, your nation, my nation, your God, my God. They come to Beit Lechem, where the family is originally from, city of Beit Lechem, in territory of Yehuda. And they're very poor. They have no income. So Ruth goes and she collects wheat, like the poor people, from the leftovers that are left in the field. Well, it happened to be that that field belongs to Boaz, who is a relative of Elimelech. He's a relative of the family. And Boaz notices her. There are different interpretations why. Usually it was, like, one interpretation is that usually it was like the younger people, like kids, used to do that, collect the sheaves, the wheat, and she was already 40, so that was kind of unusual, and therefore he noticed her. Other interpretations because she was beautiful, and different interpretations because she was very modest. Doesn't matter. The point is he noticed her, and he gives her like extra attention and extra portion of wheat, and okay, and he tells her, I know the family, blah blah blah.
How much is Boaz older than her?
According to tradition, much. He's about 80. That's again, it's a midrash, we don't know, but that's a tradition. And what happened is that Naomi comes with a plan. She says to Ruth, go visit him during the night. She goes. It's very unclear what happened, but they make a deal, some sort of a deal. And then he tried to find out a solution how to marry her. Because here's the problem. The problem is that we're not allowed to marry Moab. There is no such, according to the Torah, there is no such thing as conversion for somebody who is a Moabite. Okay? Boaz, together with the Beit Din, with the elders, they worked out a new interpretation of the Torah commandment. Took them 3 months, but they worked it out, meaning that the Torah prohibition is on the men, but not on the women. You can marry the women of Moab, but not the men of Moab. And indeed, they get married. To make a long story short, she gives birth to a son, etc., blah, blah, blah. The 4th generation is David, and that's the last word of the Megillah. Okay? That's the story of Megillat Ruth. And it's a story that demonstrates our belief in tikkun, in repair. It starts with death and ends with life. It's a tragedy that becomes nachat. It's suffering that transfers into hope. And it's all because chesed, acts of love. And then we said that it's the day on which King David was born and died. And as I said, the Megillah ends with the lineage of King David, where David is the last word of the Megillah. Now you ask me, so what? Who cares? But David, more than any other character in the Bible, represent the characteristic of the holiday. In this Megillah, in this book, there's a lot of tikkun, and that tikkun is done by chesed. Ruth with Naomi, Boaz with Ruth, Ruth with Boaz, Boaz with Naomi. And not only that, there's a pasuk there in the book that says, Baruch hu Adonai asher lo azav chasdo et hachayim ve'et hametim, meaning that God is going to do chesed. That means we know that the chesed, the tikkun, the repair is going to be also with the past, with those who are already dead. Achayim ve'hametim. Where do we find the word chesed in the Torah? Well, some places that are expected, right? Okay, that makes sense. Avimelech, Abraham, there's acts of chesed. One of the unexpected places, and we spoke about it many years ago when we had one of the classes, I don't remember even what. One of the unexpected locations is the Arayot. The sections in the Torah in Sefer Vayikra, it talks about forbidden sexual relations. Talks, and to be more exact, talks about relations between siblings, and that the Torah obviously prohibited. But it's called chesed. It's called chesed. Now, I want to pause here for a second. Relations between siblings. No. Men and women, meaning sexual relations. Okay. Incest. In some way, right? So, where do we learn about that? No. But there was no relation between Rachel and Leah. Siblings, that means the two siblings, they each had Jacob, who was not their sibling. Yeah, I mean two siblings sleeping together, okay, to put it simple. Where was that? Well, that comes right after, much after the Torah. I'm talking about where, okay. We talked about that in the past. It's Cain and Hevel. If you remember, according to the Midrash, what happened? Cain was born with a twin sister, and Hevel was born with two twin sisters. And not only that, I mean, first of all, it makes sense because if they were the only people in the world, right? If there was only Cain and Hevel, it's kind of impossible to continue the world, right? There's got to be like a woman or several women somewhere, right? As far as I know, men cannot procreate on their own, right? So according to Midrash, Cain had a twin sister, and Hevel had two twin sisters. And actually, the Midrash goes on and explain that was the reason why they had a fight. Remember, at the end, Cain kills Hevel. They fought about something. We don't know what, right? The Torah doesn't tell us why. The Midrash comes and tells us that they were fighting about the third sister. Who's going to have the third sister? This is what okay. And that obviously led to the first murder.
The son of Noach, and Abraham and Sarah.
No. When it comes to Noach, their kids were their kids were already married and had their wives with them in the flood, in the Teva. Okay, so the pasuk in Tehillim. Oops, I'm sorry about that, Shoshana. Well, we'll get there in a minute. The pasuk in Tehillim says, "Olam chesed yibaneh," and the regular, normal interpretation of that means that the world exists on acts of chesed. That's the interpretation. But Chazal expand on that, and they said, what? The continuation of the world enabled because God allowed Cain and Hevel to be with their sisters. Okay? I know. Let's put our feelings aside. Okay? Radical situation requires radical solutions. Okay. Anyway, so what does it mean, chesed? It means that I'm breaking the taboo, right? Across the line. I get rid of the boundaries, the norms, and that could be in a positive or in a negative way. Right? For Cain and Hevel, I mean, obviously, God allowed them because they were very unusual circumstances. They were the only people in the world, right? That's in a negative way. But chesed, if I don't have to do something for you, but if I'm going to do that, and I'm going to go out of my way, and I'm going to do something, act of love, that I don't have to, That's also chesed, in a positive way. Okay? So we have the negative and we have the, but that's the meaning of the word chesed. Back to David. David is the ultimate Baal Tshuva. Why? Because he makes mistakes, because he sinned. But he always takes responsibility and tries to fix it. He does tikkun as much as possible. Not always it's possible. And we identify with David because he's imperfect. Right? Unlike Moses, unlike Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, they're perfect. They're like, right, like on the top of the pedestal. You can't identify with them. With David, we can identify because we all sin, we all make mistakes, and we can identify. This is why David is the only one we called Chai V'Kayam. He's alive. What does it mean he's alive? He's not, figuratively, he's alive. Why? Because we identify with him. Okay, he's not like Moses. Okay, now, how did David become like that? The ultimate Baal Tshuva. It's a DNA of chesed. It's because of his ancestors and their acts of chesed. And the book of Ruth creates a connection to the lineage of David, as we mentioned right there, but it's much more than that. We'll see in a minute. So the way, so to say, to the final product, which is David, goes through chesed and through those characters. We're going to talk about them now. We have to ask ourselves at the end, what's the message? First story. Ruth is called Ruth HaMoaviyah, Ruth that came from Moab. What's the beginning of Moab? Well, we have to go back. Remember Abraham? Good. You remember Abraham had a nephew named Lot, right? They separate because they have dispute over property and etc. Okay, what happened to Lot? He goes and he lives in Sodom.
Is he the one who separated?
Yes, perfect. So he goes and lives in Sodom, and in Sodom he marries a local girl, and he has 2 daughters. Okay, make a long story short, God decides to turn over to destroy Sodom because it's a very bad place, and decides to spare the life of Lot and his family. Okay, everybody's familiar with the story, but when Sodom is being destroyed, Lot is running away. His wife, on the process, becomes a pillar of salt. Fine, he ends up in the cave with his 2 daughters in a place called Mitzab. Okay, what happens? They think it's the end of humankind, of the world. The whole universe is destroyed. They don't realize it's only the city of Sodom. They thought the entire world was destroyed, and therefore, in order to continue mankind, they decide to sleep with their father. And each one of them becomes pregnant as a result, right? He's drunk, and the oldest one gives birth to a son called Moab, the youngest to a son called Ammon. That's the beginning of the nation of Moab and Ammon. Okay? Many generations later on, when the Jews leave Mitzrayim, leave Egypt, and they go through the desert and they want to go into Eretz Israel, Moab refused to let them go through the land. Not only that, they don't greet them with water and bread, and these are supposed to be family, right? They're the children / grandchildren of Lot, right, who is nephew of Abraham. Not only that, they hire Bil'am to curse the Jewish people. Okay, that turned to be a blessing, but whatever, but that was their intention. And therefore the Torah said, Gam dor asiri lo yavo la'im bikal Hashem. Unlike Egyptians, unlike any other nation, Moab and Ammon cannot become Jewish no matter what. That was the challenge that Boaz had. Boaz had that challenge. How are we going to marry Ruth? You can't marry somebody from Moab. Okay. What's the parallelism? What's the similarities between the two stories? Meaning the story of Lot and the story of the Megillah. Well, in both cases, we're talking about a man and two women, right? Boaz, Naomi, and Ruth. Lot and his two daughters. We're afraid that there's not going to be a next generation in both cases. In both cases, the women are the ones to take the initiative. In both cases, we're talking about a man that he's not really focused. He's not really there. Lot was drunk and Boaz was asleep. Right? In both cases, those women come at night. And in both cases, the result was a baby boy. But in spite of those similarities, the differences are humongous. Sodom is a center of hatred towards the stranger, but the Megillah does chesed with the strangers. Lot separates from Abraham, but Ruth decides to cling and stay with Naomi. The daughters of Lot are involved in incest with her father, but in the story of Ruth, she becomes the symbol of modesty. Sodom is an example for negative chesed, but the Megillah is the example of positive chesed. So Ruth, who is the great granddaughter of Moab, becomes the tikkun, the repair for the daughter of Lot. So tikkun is possible. Not only possible, it's desirable, even hundreds of years later. How? Through chesed. Second story, a lot of similarities, and this is a story we dissected a lot throughout the years. It's the story of Yehuda and Tamar. First of all, when the elders give the blessing to Boaz, they say, "And may your house be like the house of Peretz, whom Tamar bore to Judah." So first of all, it's right there, black and white. The book itself, the book of Ruth, already make that connection to Tamar and Yehuda. Now, the story of Tamar and Yehuda appears on chapter 38 in Genesis. And it's very interesting because it cuts the story of Joseph right in the middle. If you remember the story of Joseph, okay, he got into trouble with his brothers. They throw him in the pit and they decide to sell him, right? And then those merchants, they take him out of the pit. Boom, that's the end of chapter 37. Chapter 38 starts by Yered Yehuda me'et Echav. Yehuda separates from his brothers. And that's the whole story of Judah and Tamar. And then chapter 39 continues the story of 37. Yosef hurad Mitzrayim. And Joseph ended up in Egypt. So all the Mefarshim are dealing with that. Like, why that story of Judah and Tamar breaks the story of Joseph? What's the story, very, very quickly, the story of Yehuda and Tamar? So according to the Mefarshim and everything, so Yehuda, because of, if you remember, Yehuda is the one that convinced the brothers to sell Yosef. And I guess there were problems after that. I mean, they go home and then, Jacob, they see the reaction that Jacob has, and Vayima'en Nachem, and etc., etc. It's difficult, and a friction starts between the brothers because of what they have done. And as a result of that, Yehuda leaves the family, goes to a different place, have new friends, marry a local girl, Canaanite woman, and have 3 sons, Onan, and Shelah. Gets married to a girl named Tamar, but he dies before they have children. Then she gets married to his brother, Onan. He too dies before they have children. So she wants to marry the third one, Shelah. At that point, Yehuda says, I don't think so, not so quickly. So he tells her, listen, wait until he's old enough and then we'll do that. But she sees the time goes by and it's not happening. So she decides to take matter into her own hands. In the meantime, Yehuda's wife dies. And after a couple of months, it was the time of shearing of the sheep. And she decides to take action into her hands. She disguises herself as a prostitute. She meets him on the way. And after a discussion of what's going to be the payment, it's going to be a goat, they are together. But he doesn't have that goat. So he says, I'm going to send the goat tomorrow. And she said, well, I need a collateral. That's going to be your seal, your wrap, and your staff. And he agrees to that. The next day, he sends the goat. She disappears. 3 months later, he hears that she is pregnant. Well, if she's pregnant and she was supposed to stay home and wait for my third son, that means she was unloyal to our family. And therefore, she needs to die, Judah says. She doesn't embarrass him. She says, as she's taking out to be burned, no less, she says, I'm pregnant from that person who's the owner of those items. At that point, Yehuda, and she doesn't embarrass him in public, Yehuda recognized that that's his defining moment. And he says, Tzadka mimeni, she was right, I was wrong. And the result, later on, she gives birth to twins, Peretz and Zerach. Peretz, great-great-great-great-grandfather of Boaz. Yes? Okay. So because of the tikkun, because of the repair of Yehuda, he becomes the leader. It's a defining moment for Yehuda. Especially we can see that immediately after that, where he stands against Yosef's decree, protecting Benjamin. And because of that, he earned the crown, kingship, for the tribe of Judah. What's the similarities to our story of the Megillah? Well, in both stories, story of the Megillah and the story of Yehuda and Tamar, we're talking about a separation of the male figure. Yehuda separates from the family, goes to a different place. Elimelech takes his family and goes to the land of Moab. Both cases, we're talking about moving to a different geographical area. It's a problematic move. We're talking both cases, we're talking about marriage with local girls, marriages that are prohibited. In both cases, we're talking about two sons that die, Machlon and Chilion, Elimelech, and also the first two sons of Yehuda. We're talking about two widows that remain childless. Both widows want to perpetuate the dead, both Ruth and Tamar. Both of them face obstacles. Both of them take initiative. Both of them use a move that is unconventional or could be interpreted as improper. And in both cases, we're talking about a form of leverage marriage, of yibum, but not in the classic way. In the classic way, it's the brother of the dead brother marries the widow. Here, we're talking about the father-in-law that ends up with the daughter-in-law. And in the case of Boaz and Ruth, they're distant relatives or whatever you want to call it. Okay? And in both cases, the motive is the continuation of the family / the tribe. If not for that action, it would be the end of the family. Chesed. Have that in mind. If you remember, I mentioned it many times in the past. When we talk about pregnancy and infertility in the Bible, it is described as God opening and closing the womb of a woman. Right? God has the key, so to say, to open and close the womb of a woman. So, from the fact that both the daughter of Lot and Tamar become pregnant immediately, it tells us what? That God approves that plan. With all the difficulties, with all the incest and whatever you want to call it, everything, God approved that, because otherwise God would not let them become pregnant. Now, it's 10 generations from Peretz, the son of Judah and Tamar, to David. This is not a coincidence. 10 generations, very significant number. Adam to Noah, 10 generations. Noah to Abraham, 10 generations. Which tells you what? Destiny. Destiny. It's very clear. Another one that you mentioned, Rabbi and Rabat. The DNA of Leah is also there. Because remember, Leah is the mother of Yehuda. Her DNA is there also, because she does chesed with her sister, with Rachel. Remember, Leah was the first one to marry Jacob. She could have put like a scene and say to him, there's no way you're going to marry my sister. I'm not going to let it happen. Blah, 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 blah. She could have done it, but she didn't. Not only that, as Rivka mentioned, she helps her. And knowing that Jacob loves Rachel more than her. And she knows that immediately her status is going to decrease. She knows that. She's not stupid. She knows that. Nonetheless, she does that. So there's chesed there. Another one. Miriam, remember her? Moses' sister. Her DNA is also there. You remember, I don't know if you remember when we discussed her many, a couple of years ago. We said according to the Midrash, she married Kalev. Kalev ben Yefuneh, if you remember the story of the spies, Kalev and Joshua are the only two spies that told the truth. Right? So Miriam married Kalev. Who was Kalev? The great-great-grandfather of Boaz. Now, remember the story about Miriam getting tzarat? Okay. Miriam gets tzarat. Why? Because she speaks Lashon Hara of Moshe. Right? To make a long story short. Right? So she's impulsive. She doesn't think it through sometimes. She's impulsive. Guess what? That characteristic ended up with David. Right? That transfer in the DNA, that's part of the genes. Because David also sometimes reacts in an impulsive way. The story of Navala Carmeli, story of Bathsheba, a bunch of other stories that we analyzed over the years. Now, we said these are some of the stuff that I mentioned, the Midrashim. I want to make it very, very clear. When I talk about Midrash, it's not something that necessarily happened in reality. I don't know. Maybe yes, maybe no. It was written by Chazal. It was written by the rabbis. What's the purpose? Pedagogical one, to teach us something. So the question is not whether that happened or not, but rather, what's the reason it was written? What am I supposed to learn from that? Okay? And it's purely my theory. If you don't like it, don't use it. What's the connection? Or why the rabbis go out of their way with that midrash, with Miriam and everything? Because they need to create a connection between what? Miriam, i.e. the family of Moshe, and David. They need to find that connection. Why? Remember, because as part of the theological change, David goes through some sort of a metamorphosis as well. From a warrior, the way he is depicted in the stories of the Bible, how he is described by Chazal? By Chazal, he is described as somebody who sits in the Beit Midrash. He learns Torah. Because now, what's important is not defending the land, because the land, well, they're in exile already. And there's no land to defend. There's no, right? There's no enemies to fight with. What is it to do? Torah study. So David, in the liturgy of Chazal, is also sits and learns. Right? He goes through this metamorphosis. He is a Talmid Chacham. Okay? So, if he is somebody who spends his days and nights in the halls of study Torah, in studying Torah, we need to find a connection between him and the ultimate teacher of Torah, Moses. How that's going to happen? Through his sister. Okay. So we said that the men, Yehuda, earned Malchut, kingship. Caleb, the husband of Miriam, despite it, told the truth. I think there's a movie like that, says that. From him, he got courage. David gets the courage. Boaz, that's again, according to the Midrash, we spoke about that in the past. Boaz, who is it according to Midrash, is who? The judge Ivtzan. If you remember, we talked about that a long time ago. Ivtzan is one of the judges, right? One of the judges in the book of Judges. And according to the Midrash, he loses his family, his wife dies, his children die, and all because of a flaw in his character. So Boaz himself goes through a change, through a repair, through a tikkun, and becomes a Baal Chesed. He's the one that takes care of the poor. He's the one that takes care of the needy. He's the one that takes care of Ruth, that stranger. Why this is important? Because the father of the lineage of David, Boaz, we want him to be somebody who recognizes the value of second chance. Somebody who takes responsibility. Somebody who corrected his own ways. Father of the lineage of David, because David himself. Okay, back to Yehuda. When Judah says, I'm the guarantor for Benjamin, that's the tikkun, that's the repair for what? For selling Yosef. The way he treated one brother, now he's going to be exactly the opposite. When he decides to save Tamar, that's the tikkun for the way he treated her before. The way he misled her. Boaz with Ruth are going to be the tikkun for Boaz's previous life as Ivtzan. And David is going to create tikkun for his own sins and for the sins of his ancestors. Why? As I said in the beginning, to restore harmony and hope into the world. Which brings us to the fourth, actually not the fourth, it's the sixth figure. Nitzevet. Who was Nitzevet? Anyone remembers? That's David's mother. Nitzevet bat Adiel. She was married to Jesse. Right? Ishai. David ben Ishai. Right. Good. What's the story there? I don't know if you remember. The story of Nitzevet is a fascinating one. Nitzevet and Jesse are married. Mazel tov. They have 6 boys. Everything is great. At that point, after 6 boys, Jesse goes through some sort of doubt, whether, call it midlife crisis, I don't know, whether he's Jewish or not. Why? Because remember, his great-grandmother was Ruth. 4 generations later, people are still talking about this idea that Ruth converted. Maybe it's not really kosher. The Torah says no. I get it. Yes, the Beit with Boaz, they made some sort of a deal. They worked it out. I don't know. This is only just regular hashgacha. It's not glat. I don't know what's the story there. So people were still talking about this. There was a tremendous novelty. what Boaz did with the Beit Din. Not everybody accepted it at that time. So 4 generations later, people still talking. And Jesse at that point says, maybe they're right. Maybe I'm not Jewish. And if I'm not Jewish, then I caused my wife to live it in sin. So he separates from her. Okay. Fast forward 3 years. At the end of the day, I guess he's still a man. He wants to be with somebody. They have a very beautiful servant, and he wants to be with her. And he talks to her. What does she do? She go to her mistress, to Nitzevet. She said, listen, your husband want to be with me. And they come together, they come with a plan. And the plan, to make a long story short, it's going to be pitch black. It's like, you tell him to come to that particular room where there are 2 doors in the room, and you're going to call him, then you're going to lift through the other door, and I'm going to go in, right? I don't know if you remember that story, but to make a long story short, Yishai, Jesse, ends up with his own wife, not knowing that was her. Fast forward, he sees that his wife is pregnant. He knows that he hasn't been with her. So that means she cheated on him. Okay? To prevent a great shanda, they don't get a divorce, but he doesn't recognize David as his own son. What's the proof for that? If you remember, when Samuel, we spoke about that a couple of weeks ago, when Samuel goes to anoint David, God tells him, go to the house of Jesse and anoint one of the sons of Jesse. It doesn't tell him which son, right? And David goes to Jesse and said, bring all your sons. And Jesse brings 6. Not David, brings only 6. And of course, the miracle that's supposed to happen, like the oil is going to jump, whatever, not happening. Not with Eliav, the first one, not the second, not the third, no, not happening. And Samuel says to Jesse, something is not working here. Don't you have other sons? And he says, no. Well, maybe there's another one that he's with the sheep. He's not real. And Samuel tells him, bring him over. And of course, the miracle happens. And only then Jesse recognized that David indeed is his son, because God says the son of Jesse. But up until that point, Jesse doesn't recognize David as his son, only as his, call it the bastard son.
I was just curious. I was wondering if Samuel knows, but he didn't say, "Do you have other sons?"
He did.
No, he said, maybe.
He said, "Al tamu lecha anarim." He said,
Do you have other youth?
do you have other sons? He said, like, is this all the sons that you have? Do you have any others?
Was David a redhead?
Yeah.
So Rudy, I can't read Hebrew, but
Yeah.
I would just say Rudy.
Yeah,
So Rudy was,
redhead.
oh wow. Okay.
Yeah. So the motive here in this story is also Nitzevet does chesed with her husband Yishai. It brings into the birth of King David. And of course, we see also progression and refinement from each generation, from the stories, right? In all the elements, there's a tragedy and motivation. Okay, the daughter of Lot thought it was the end of the world. Tamar thought it's going to be the end of the tribe. So we go from, with Ruth, that's going to be the end of the family. And the story of Nitzevet, we're talking about another child into the family. So you see the same, and you see the progression and refinement. Getting pregnant from your own father, the story of daughter of Lot, getting pregnant from your father-in-law, Tamar, getting pregnant from a relative, that's Boaz and Ruth, and getting pregnant from your own husband. It's the story of Nitzevet and Yishai. Lineage. right? The daughter of Lot, she is the mother of the nation of Moab, which is a big no-no, right? To Tamar, who was maybe a nice girl, but not Jewish, not part of, right? Into Ruth, who was a convert, into Nitzevet, who was righteous. You see like the progression here. Abandonment, that's another element here, right? The daughters of Lot thought that they were abandoned by the entire world. They thought it was the end of the world. Well, in the story of Tamar, she was abandoned by the entire family. The story of Ruth, she was abandoned by some of the family. She was still with Naomi. And the story of Nitzevet, we're talking about marital challenges. The connection to David, right? A separate nation is Moab. To the tribe, Yehuda, to which David belongs. To the family, the extended family, the family of Boaz, and to mother of David. So you see also the progression here. So let's summarize. All these women were alien to the Jewish people. They all lived in the margins of society. They all experienced rejection, abandonment, crisis, misconduct, but they all showed loyalty and responsibility. And that's exactly the anti-myth of the hero. You know, the myth of the hero is that, you know, somebody has a, you know, the royal blood, the blue blood, whatever, the royal blood, and no matter what the circumstances are, he's always going to emerge because he's destined to be the king, even if he grew up in poverty and whatever, right? The story of David is exactly the opposite. David is the underground. He is the smallest. He is the rejected one. He's got problematic lineage, etc. Nonetheless, he emerges as ultimate king. And in general, we see a lot of similarities between the story of Megillat Ruth and the book of Genesis. Remember, like, for example, Lech Lecha, right? God says to Abram, Lech Lecha, leave everything behind, go to a different unknown land, etc. But who does that? Ruth. She leaves everything behind in Moab and she goes to unknown land, Israel. Okay? In both cases, we're talking about a place where there's famine. Right? The story of the Megillah starts with famine, and the story of in the book of Genesis, there's several times we're talking about famine. The couple actually meet first. The first time they meet as strangers. Yaakov and Rachel, they meet by the well as strangers. They don't, right? Only then they, right? Same goes for Boaz and Ruth. They meet first as strangers. Why is that? Why those and many, many others? Why the similarities? Because the book of Genesis is the background for the birth of a nation, which is going to happen in the book of Exodus. We start with found family, but that's the background for the birth of a nation. What is the book of Ruth? Is the background for the birth of kingship, monarchy. And what we're trying to do here, I'm just gonna summarize that, is, that our ancestors hold the key perhaps to our history, but they neither guarantee nor limit our legacy. That's what we're trying to say here. That's the story of David. And the Chazal indeed teach us that the crown of Torah is greater than the crown of priesthood and sovereignty because it is available to all who want it. It's not going to help you how much money you have and what you're willing to do in order to become a Kohen. If you were not born in a Kohen, it's not going to help you. Same goes for sovereignty. The king, to become a king, you have to be from a descendant of David. Doesn't matter what you, otherwise you have no chance. But the crown of Torah is available to anyone, not just to those who are born to it. So what really matters, and the message is, what do you do, not where you come from. Look at David. He becomes the ultimate king, even though he's the underdog, he's the smallest, he's the rejected, he's the one that has the problematic lineage, etc., etc., etc. We're not looking for perfection. We're looking for acts. We're looking for somebody who takes responsibility and does tikkun, repair. How? Through chesed. And that's what we learn from David, who was born and died on Shavuot. David, whose DNA was refined through all those generations, all those ancestors, all those women that we just discussed, all those parallel stories, the daughter of Lot, Tamar, Nitzevet, Rachel, Leah, Miriam. And indeed, as I mentioned in the beginning, our world is injured and hurt. And we just learned that acts of chesed can build, can repair the world. We have the ability to repair the abuse, the injustice, the oppression, the jealousy, the anger, the tragedy. Together we can do that. We can restore harmony and hope to this world. How are we going to heal that world? With the love that we do. Acts of love. That is all about. That was my share. I think because of I'm going to open everybody's mics in a second. Because of all the parallel stories and everything, I thought it works with our series. I'm actually so obsessed with some of the elements of the Megillah that I think I'm going to expand on that stuff next week, and find some parallelism between the story of Ruth, perhaps, and where we actually ended up with David and Abigail. We discussed that 2 weeks ago. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you guys to unmute if you want to ask any question, or anyone here has any question, any comment. And Shoshana, yeah, just, yeah.
Just the saying, like mitzvah has in her